Three, two, one. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of Tales from the Wandering Scribes Historians Lounge series. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, the Wandering Quill and Wandering Scribe. Joining me today is a guest who is a jack of all trades. She is a early American colonial historian. She is an author. She is a blogger. She is a content creator. She has her own YouTube channel. As I said, she is a jack of all trades. Joining us today to discuss Lincoln's early upbringings before he became the President of the United States, Angelina Kaul. Did I get your name right?
Yes, you did. And thank you for that awesome introduction. I appreciate that.
You're welcome, Angelina. So, what else can you tell us a little bit about yourself besides the little brief introduction I gave?
Sure, Gabriel. So basically, as you said, I am a historian. I'm a professional writer. I'm an artist. I am a designer. I am a serial entrepreneur. And so I'm also creating content for people, other artists, other designers, businesses, and whatnot. So I've got a whole big portfolio of different things that I do. I'd like to say that everything that I do is related to the creative world because that's who I am. And I enjoy doing everything that I do, and I'm hoping to continuously grow that. And so far, it's going pretty good, and I'm happy with
That's
it.
good. That's actually really good. And speaking of one of your projects, I know we spoke, this is going back a while ago, about the topic for today's episode, which is of Lincoln's childhood. And I know I looked on your site to get a little bit more information, and you've been actually researching this and going more in depth about this for a while. So, what about Lincoln's childhood as opposed to other aspects of his upbringing? That was the one period of him that you wanted to explore.
Okay, so that's a good question, Gabriel. If you look around, and I've been writing on this, if you look around Lincoln's life, I think it's rated as one of the top biographies. Any bookstore you go to, there's a plethora of Lincoln biographies. And if you look around, most of them are, dealing with his time as the president or the Civil War or, some such that area. You may find some that are related with his time in Springfield as a young man, but
Mm-hmm.
there's hardly anything available of his formative years in Indiana. So being that I am at the moment in Indiana and I have, definitely had access to whatever materials out there on him for that time period, um, I decided, I wanted to kind of write about that moment of his life because there isn't a lot of material on it. And there are some biographies already on the market. One of them, I would consider it a classic study, was published in 1959.
Hmm.
And it has been in reprint because it's just that important. But I wanted to bring something new to the market, not just about his life, but from the different, theories that are surrounding that time of his life in terms of actual historical research and what the scholars have said about it and what the um, amateur researchers and historians have said about that period of his life. So I'm trying to give my book, which I'm working on right now, a little bit of a twist to that understanding of Lincoln's life in that time.
That's interesting because I don't know if you may have seen this, but I think it was last year or the year before. There was actually on the History Channel, which was a series called President, and they did Washington, they did Grant, and they did Lincoln. And I saw that documentary, and it's fascinating looking at who Lincoln was and his upbringing. Because yes, as you said, we only typically get to see him when he's either statesman or he's the president of the
Right.
United States. But we don't typically see the man behind the top hat. And his childhood is very, very what's the word I'm thinking of? Very, very modest in that sense of how he grew up and what his life was like. Because I'm sure if you made done your research, um, Lincoln had the fortune of having a stepmother, if I'm not mistaken, having a stepmother who taught him and encouraged him, to read, to pursue his passions in a time in his area when he had to work. He had to work a lot. And just seeing all this around him is just fascinating. And in your research, what are some of like the things you've uncovered about Lincoln's formative years that you feel should get more relevancy in terms of like who he later becomes?
Sure. So the way that this period of Lincoln's life is split up into, okay, you've got scholars who think that um, Lincoln, his time in Indiana in particular was sort of like a waste because there was nothing happening here. So it didn't contribute anything towards his being who he became. In fact, it's called, if I may quote, it's called the dunghill thesis. And then
Wow.
you have yeah, literally. So, and the other half of the other side of the equation is people who are saying that, okay, maybe Indiana wasn't, because at this period Indiana is a frontier, so maybe there's nothing great about Indiana at this point in time. And some may argue even now, but that's a different story altogether. But at his time, certainly there's nothing happening here, yet there are things that are happening that are enabling Lincoln to grow and mature into the young man he will become as we see him as a leader down the road. My my take on this is a unique take, which is what my whole book is going to be about. That's the manuscript I'm working on right now. And that is that, I feel both sides have definitely a point. Having lived in Indiana myself, I can totally understand that. Um, Even though I'm living here now, yet I do understand where those two theories are coming from. But at the same time, I feel the crucial point of that is, without Lincoln's own desire to want to become who he became, neither theory matters really.
Right.
We can say that, okay, he didn't have the educational opportunities or whatever, and then we can say, well, he had different types of educational opportunities, which is what essentially the argument is. But my point is that it wouldn't have mattered either way if it wasn't for Lincoln, for who he himself was. It was his desire, it was his um, passion to go out there and get an education that propelled him into greatness. Whether or not one or the other places, one or the other theory may have been correct or not. So that is what I'm trying to point out in my book, and that's what I'm sharing with the world now. Some may argue that no, one is right, the other is not, but I'm trying to show that it's a combination of the two that made him who he was because of who he already was, what was already in him.
Fascinating. And yeah, as you said, at this time, Indiana is pretty much a frontiers
Yeah.
territory. To people who live on the East Coast, I mean, they see it like a backwoods country, and here you have this
Yes.
young upstart, this lanky limb individual who has a way with words, and somehow people tend to follow him. Which, to looking at Lincoln's upbringing, he was very, very fortunate, and I also think we don't really take into consideration growing up on the frontier and growing up in the city at that time drastically changes your outlook on life. I know you even look at that now, today in the 21st century, but especially back then in the early 19th century, frontier life was not easy. You had to um, live on your own. You had to fight for what you needed to fight. You had to make your own living. And in the frontier world, you were a craftsman, a tradesman of either whatever trade was available, as opposed to those who lived on the East Coast. And that's not to say that those who were in the East Coast fared better than those on the frontier. They still have their own difficulties, but still, they were still slightly better than in terms of upbringing, at least someone argue at that time. But would you also agree that Lincoln kind of used his upbringing to have him explore the world in this kind of practical sense, this kind of human sense, because I definitely feel a lot of presidents that came after Lincoln kind of kept that sense of that humanity, that sense of like being the common man. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh yeah, actually, Gabriel, the whole idea of the common man goes back to Andrew Jackson. So this is when in fact, that's one of the reasons that he is able to get elected and get into office, is because he has this persona. And
Mm.
early 19th century is the turn of the century where up until that time we've had, especially in young men who kind of lived with the family, lived the father has the farm and so on and so forth, and they're just picking up and taking over and going on along with that. But as we're coming into the 19th century, what's happening is that we're seeing sons who want to go out there and just venture out on their own. They want to establish themselves, they want to do something that's different, unique. And so a lot of them are coming out into the frontier. Again, Indiana right now is the frontier. So they're traveling further west to get land, to get work, to establish themselves and be something. And so Lincoln is no different. And uh, this definitely is part of this whole American mindset at this point, which is where, if you look at modern American thought, the way we think, we want to go out there and be the entrepreneur, start our own
Right.
business or own our own house and do all these things and build. And, all of that comes back to this era where we're now becoming this American mindset, the quintessential American thought that we want to do things, we want to build things, we want to be our own kind of people, have our own thing. So Lincoln is like literally in many ways a pioneer, because he's right at the front lines of this kind of thinking, and that's what he's coming into as a young man. That's what he's being raised in, that kind of atmosphere.
Yeah, and that's actually, I think that says for a lot of people around this time, especially coming into like the early to mid 1800s. It's a very kind of turning point in the nation's history
Mhm.
where we don't know where we're going to be. There's a lot of issues up and about, and that's actually one thing I did want to talk to you about. So, in your book on Lincoln's childhood, do you touch on some of the issues that America was facing at the time in terms of like how it connects with um, Lincoln's upbringing?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm planning to, talk about the early Republic period, which is my area of expertise. And, we're going to talk about, or we're going to see in my book, what's happening culturally, what's happening economically. We've had the War of 1812. So there's the burden of, people that are on the East Coast. We're
Hmm.
financially strapped because we just went through this war, so we're looking for different opportunities. And as I said, there's a whole bunch of different, if you just look at the Indiana years, from the time he's moved to Kentucky to Indiana and all the way up to 1830 when he moves further into Illinois, there's a lot happening in those years, in that time span. Of course, we still haven't hit the gold rush, which
Right.
at that point it just completely opens up everything to everyone.
Hmm.
But we're leading up to those moments. We're leading up to eventually, the issue of slavery and economic impact, and what's happening between the different political parties and how they're coming up, and how they're formulating in the Midwest nationally. If we consider the time period, one of the most important figures in Lincoln's life was Henry Clay. Henry
Right.
Clay is talking about the American system, which is what? It's the infrastructure of the whole nation. How do we go from one place to another? How are things moved? How do we supply goods? Things like that. All of that is taking place. Education. All of that is taking place in this time period. And the American system, which I hope to plan on extending in a different book, is dating back to Alexander Hamilton's time and his thought on how the country should be and how we should be running as a country, and different aspects, again, with education, whatever the case may be. So this is trickled down to Henry Clay, and Henry Clay obviously is one of the important personalities in Lincoln's life,
Hmm.
and so we have all of this happening all the way into his formative years. So Lincoln is not just he's not just being influenced by what's happening at the national scale, which the scholars have argued, okay, this is why he wanted to get out of Indiana, and because he wanted more. True enough, but he's also being influenced by what's happening around him, which we can argue there wasn't much happening. It's frontier society, but that in itself was making him think about what he wanted, right? So when
Right.
we think of the word education, people automatically think, oh, schooling, right, learning from the books and whatnot, but education actually means you can be self-taught. I'm a
Right.
self-taught artist, so I educated myself on how to draw and paint and so on and so forth. Education doesn't necessarily mean that we're sitting in a college or high school or whatever. I mean, Lincoln's education itself was minuscule. Um, he is not someone who has gone to college and got a degree or whatever. He's pretty much self-taught. So here we are, this person who has this deep desire to want to learn. Education to me means a love for learning. It's beyond just going to college or something. It's just you have this deep desire that you want to learn, you want to educate yourself, however, whatever means you can find. And so he's going through that experience, even if there is no great university at at this point in Indiana. He definitely has different sources that he's trying to gather that information from so that he can educate himself. And that's what's happening with him at this point in his life.
And I'm actually glad you actually brought that up because I agree. People, when we think of the word education, we think of university, schooling. But at this
Yeah.
point in time, unless you were from a wealthy family that could go to some of the university or schools, you really had to rely on books. That was the closest thing you had to education, as you said. So I definitely think it is important to note that at this time, if you want to educate yourself, you had to be self-taught. You had to read a lot
Yes.
of the great works at the time. And again, that is very fascinating to Lincoln's history, which I don't think we get a lot of recognition. And I also want to kind of tangent off to what you said about the early Republic history, which I feel is a period in American history which kind of gets overlooked at this period because from like a broad perspective, we see the American Revolution, War of 1812,
Yeah.
Mexican American War, and then Civil War. However, we see that the nation after the American Revolution is not the same in 1812. It's not the same in the Mexican American War. It's not even the same in 1860. So, why do you think that the early Republic years don't get a lot of recognition? And do you feel that they are equally important to like the major events of our nation's history?
Well, I definitely think they're important. That's why I made sure that was my major, that was my focus. Um, I think that it's almost like there's a term in Midwest, a flyover country, right? So you either look at everything that has happened on the East Coast, and by the way, I come from the East Coast, so I'm like right from the Washington D.C. area. So you've got all these great schools, universities, and you've got art, you've got museums, you've got tons of history there. But then you're either there or you fly over the Midwest, and you are on the West Coast, with California and all the movies and Hollywood and
Right.
all this stuff, whatnot. So what happens is that this part of the country is virtually, there's so much history here. I don't know, a lot of people don't realize that some parts of the Revolutionary War occurred right here in on Indiana turf.
Hmm.
So most people don't understand that or don't know about it because everything is very minimal when you compare it to the two different coasts, and we're sandwiched in between that. And
Right.
so this period, the early Republic period, is sort of like that. You get sandwiched between the American Revolutionary period, and then once we hit the, like I said, once we hit the gold rush era, and then we've got the Civil War. Everything is just booming in that part of history, and we just kind of squeeze. You're lucky. You mentioned War of 1812. It's like
Right.
you're lucky if you see something on that, even because it's also understudied, in my opinion.
Right.
But definitely this period where Lincoln is growing up and he's coming of age, we don't have a lot happening there, and this is why I wanted to focus in on this time in his life, because I think this is where he is growing up to be what we will down the road see, you know, pre-Civil War in the antebellum period, and then of course in the Civil War and
Right.
thereafter the Reconstruction and whatnot. So it is an important part of history. If we are to understand, and I think one of the reasons that it is kind of understudied when it comes to his life is because there's not a ton of primary sources on
Right.
this part of, so that kind of makes it challenging to, you know, find something to write about and at length and deeply and effectively. So that is definitely a challenge, and I understand that, but I still wanted to tackle it. Fortunately, there have been books out there. I was able to find some primary sources that you can kind of build on, and that's what I'm hoping to do. I mean, my last book that I wrote was on one of Alexander Hamilton's sons, and
Mm.
there was even less information on him in terms of primary sources. I had to rely a lot on his contemporary accounts, but his own work, that he left behind, there was hardly anything to find. So, I don't know, I tend to pick these difficult moments in people's life where they don't really, he didn't leave me a diary or a journal or something I could go through. So I had to rely heavily on contemporary sources. And that's sort of what's happening with Lincoln also. But, at least it allows us to put together a part of his life that we normally would not have known about. And Herndon did a good job of it. I mean, if you read his biography, he took the time to go out and interview interview Lincoln's contemporaries, and a lot of that information has been, trickled down in so many different biographies since then. And mine is no different, but it does provide you at least some context of what was happening in that person's life, and sometimes that's the best you can get.
Definitely. And
Yeah.
kind of a little tangent off of that, especially for someone like myself who is a classical antiquities historian, finding sources on Roman Greek is very
Oh
difficult
God.
to find. And then when
Yeah.
you think of, early American history, we think, okay, that's a little bit easier, that's closer to our history. Well, it depends on where the sources was written and how well kept it was, especially if you're living on the
Yeah.
frontier. And even more so if you're talking about a person at that time, in the case of Lincoln. So when you were gathering sources for Lincoln, how difficult was it to not only find primary sources, but also take those primary sources with a grain of salt? Because I know as historians, we
Mm.
got to consider that while this is very good in terms of source material, we have to acknowledge that this may not entirely be true.
Sure. Sure. And that's fair enough. But, if we look at some of, we cannot completely knock it down either. And that's my thing, because if that was the case, we would lose any kind of understanding of the Native American culture, right? Because a lot of their history is oral based, right? It's stories that have come down generation after generation after generation. So at some point, you kind of have to consider that it's not just made up stuff. And you have to, this is where if you have worked as a scholar and you're a historian, you have to be able to analyze. I mean, this is where our skills of analysis and critical thinking kick in, and
Right.
we're able to determine, okay, well, how much of this is really, evidence based, how much of it is just, opinion, and how can we combine this to come up with something that makes sense. And that's why it's important to study not just that particular person, but also their time. and
Hmm.
gathering up those contemporary sources and finding different things. And it's not just limited to friends and family. It could be their enemies. It could be
Right.
scathing letters and newspaper articles written about that person. And it's all leading to something. It's leading up to something, and it's helping you to understand who you're working on. Whether it's a person or that time period, that's what we're doing. We're synthesizing everything. And the fact of the matter is, Gabriel, and you know this,
Hmm.
you can have even primary sources that you can account for. Like, you could have a journal and a diary, and this is what that person wrote in it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what actually happened.
Right.
Or that, if they wrote that, that's what they meant. They could literally have been writing with the idea, especially if it's an important figure, that at some point my papers are going to be available to somebody who can make something
Right.
out of it. So there's always that. So we're always constantly analyzing material and looking at things, and gathering up all the information that we possibly can, and then coming up with something that makes sense and it's reasonable, that we can present to the world. And that's what I am trying to do with my work.
Nice. And actually, speaking of on your work, as you said, there's a lot of stories about Lincoln's upbringing or various parts of Lincoln's childhood. What was sort of like for you, not only as a historian, but as an author, like the challenge to not reinterpret, but reevaluate this period in Lincoln's childhood when, let's say, his fellow scholars or contemporaries would say there's nothing that needs to be evaluated or further discussed. We know what happened during this time period. Move on to something else. Why did you specifically say no? I actually want to look into this because I feel that there's something more we need to learn about Lincoln or something that has been overlooked in Lincoln's childhood. So why did you decide to still pursue this aspect of his life?
Okay, so Gabriel, I'm sure you know this because you follow me. And one of the things that I say about myself is I'm someone who is a creative and motivational storyteller. I
Right.
used to have my title as historian, artist, this and that. But this year, as a matter of fact, I decided, what is it that my work, what am I projecting with my work? Whether it's a painting, whether it's a book, what is it that I'm trying to say? And what I found about myself is that I'm a person who likes to tell stories. And I
Hmm.
want to tell the stories of the underdogs because I'd like to think I'm probably one of those people.
Hmm.
And I think we can all kind of, at some level, relate to that feeling of being an underdog at some point in our lives.
Hmm.
Most of us are inspired by stories like that. It motivates us, it encourages us. And that's really the reason I do the work that I do. I want to inspire people, I want to motivate them, I want to encourage them. Because the fact is, I say 95% of life is just challenges every day,
Right.
we deal with at one level or another. So if you've got 5% of happiness, motivation, something that you just, that inspires you, then that's worth sharing. And with Lincoln, I think he is such a source of inspiration for me personally, because he went through a lot. And that's an understatement. Here you have a young boy. He is, born and grows up. He's coming up of age in Kentucky, and he loses his brother. He
Hmm.
moves to Indiana with his mom and his dad and his sister, and then he loses his mother. And
Hmm.
then down the road, he's going to lose his sister, who had become like a mother to him, because when he lost his mom, he was very young. You know, it's, again, I, not to go back on my books, but William Alexander Hamilton's son, his father was killed in a duel, and he was right there at the age of, between 7 and 8. Imagine, looking at your father dying from a gunshot wound, bleeding all
Hmm.
over the place. That affects you for the rest of your life. So here we
Right.
have Lincoln, who is in the middle of nowhere, and his father is telling him to come and basically put together a coffin for his mother. Can you imagine doing that at that? You're like, you're not even a teenager yet. Here
Nope.
you are banging nails into a pine box where you're going to put your mom in. You cannot tell me that that doesn't affect. I mean, I'm an adult. That would affect me deeply. Imagine a young
Hmm.
child. And Lincoln, for those people who love Lincoln, I'm sure they know that he had a lot of bouts of depressions and whatnot. This goes all the way back to these years, because he's already, by the time he's not even a teenager, like I said, he's already experienced major grief and loss. And, down the road, his relationship with his father isn't the best. And there's not a lot of, it's just a lot of different things that are coming in his life and happening in his life. And a lot of them are out of control,
Right.
Here you are moving in with your mom in the middle of nowhere, thinking you're going to have a good life. And then all of a sudden this disease, this illness strikes. And you, at that time, I mean, we know what it is now, but at that time, he has no idea. The family
Right.
has no idea. And, one day she's fine, the next day she's gone. So that's a lot for someone to deal with, especially a child. And yet he's doing this and moving right along. Next thing you know, his father has gone back to Kentucky, leaving him and his little sister in the middle of nowhere to fend for themselves, and that by the time, Thomas remarries and comes back with his stepmom, who you mentioned earlier,
Hmm.
these kids have been on their own. She even leaves an account of how filthy they were, the unwashed, in rags, no food. The house is a total disaster. This is what we're growing up in, So
Yeah.
can you imagine that? We don't think about that twice, but in his time, even though there was a saying, they said, well, there's poor, and then there's a Lincoln, which is dirt poor. You're like literally have nothing. It's a pretty sad state for a young chap to grow up in, but he
Definitely.
manages through, and look at what he accomplished down the road. I think that part of his life prepared him for what was coming. I mean, maybe that's not accurate, because who can be prepared for all the disastrous consequences he faced down the road?
Right.
But what I'm trying to say is that dealing with grief and loss was nothing new to him. He'd been dealing with it ever since his childhood.
Right. And also another thing to talk about, like the time period when this is, maybe you don't really take into consideration the life, pardon me, the life expectancy in colonial America and the early republic was not that high. I think at
Yeah.
most, if you live to like 40, that's considered
You had
old.
made it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but if were like 60 or 70, you're like considered ancient. And not to mention, as you said before, the diseases and like the medicine at the time, there was very little to none, and
Yeah.
you were lucky to survive in the frontier world and even in the cities too, which I think it was even the worst because you had
Yeah.
cholera, you had disease, you had infected waters.
Oh yeah.
At least in the frontier, you have a chance to live on the land, which has not been compromised. But even still, that has its own set of challenges. So it is really fascinating how, as you said, anyone that has gone through that trauma at that time would go crazy or just be broken. But Lincoln somehow was able to use that trauma and kind of push him to be a better man, which I would 100% die on this statement. I don't think anyone from the modern period could survive in the uh, early American Republic. And not even talking about classical antiquities, early American history is not easy.
Yeah.
You would be a very, very changed man, very humbled person because the frontier definitely humbles you, which I think is how Lincoln approached everything. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, absolutely, Gabriel. I often say that, if someone came in our time from the past, they would definitely survive our period. There's no doubt. But if we were to go back, I don't know. I know personally, I don't know if I could make it. I would love to go back and see everything, but it's because they, like you mentioned the age and even the height. If you go and look at some of the clothing, they were the size of the kids today. Even
Right.
teenagers now are like towering. So there's a huge difference between so many different things today and in that time period. And so here we are. And again, if you think about Lincoln himself, he's considered awkward for that reason,
Right.
because he's like, this tall guy, with these lanky arms and stuff. By the way, um it's really not quite accurate when people say that,
Oh, okay.
well, when people say Lincoln, oh, he was just a tall, lanky guy. He was, a weakling. He was kind of skinny. This, that. No, 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 no. This man could wield an axe and take down a tree all by himself. Okay, that I don't know if you ever like chop down a tree, but it takes a lot of muscle power to make that thing come down. And
Right.
if you're making it come down and you're one man, you got some strength. And in fact, we know this also as a young man. He used to love to wrestle, and he was
Mm-hmm.
well known for that. So this is not someone who's a weakling by any means, no matter how he was characterized, in the political cartoons down the road. He's a pretty
Right.
strong guy, definitely so. And I'm so sorry, I kind of missed your question there, that you asked me. I think you were asking me about I forgot. I'm so sorry about that. I went all over the place, and I think I
It's
missed that
okay.
question.
I think you may have did answer it before, but actually, no, there was actually one thing. It's actually a while ago. It's like the misconceptions about Lincoln. I think you already like briefly on.
Yeah.
We had this opinion that he's a very tall, lanky limb, but as you said,
Hmm.
he wasn't. He was awkward looking to the people at the time, but as you said, he could wield an axe. He could cut down a tree. He
Oh
was a
yeah.
very muscular man at his time. And if you look at Lincoln's photos back
Hmm.
then before he became president, it's very, very different. Like the man's not
Yeah.
the same person anymore. Then again, there's a lot more stress he's under as opposed to in his early
Oh sure.
upbringings and
Yeah,
um
if you look at his what is considered his first photograph, if and I'm an artist, so I look at things that maybe someone else isn't looking at. So if you actually look at his hands, he's wearing the suit, right? He's sitting at an angle. If you look at his hands, you can see the strength in those hands, and you can
mm,
tell that this is a strong, typically like if you look at Michelangelo's David, the way he created that
mm,
statue, if you look at David's hand, just the hand itself, Michelangelo put like veins on that thing, and it looks like a real thing, and there's strength in that hand. If you don't even look at any other part of David, if you just look at the hand, you can see what the artist was, or the sculptor was trying to project. And you feel it, you see it. So if you look at Lincoln's photograph, you are not going to see a lanky, weak man. You're going to see
no.
someone who had some strength and could probably chop that tree down without any problems. And he did. So definitely, that was one of the things. And another perception, I'll confess. Confession time. I will confess, for the longest time when I was younger, I used to think I had this image of Lincoln that, because we hear about Honest Abe, right? So I always thought, oh, this is a humble, chap, very humble and peace loving and calm and collected and all those. Maybe later down the road, some of those elements may have come in, but the period that I'm working in, oh my gosh, was it an eye opener for me? He is
Mm,
precocious. He has a mind of his own. He can get downright nasty. If
wow.
he's like, if you get on his wrong side, he can be pretty, firm, and I don't want to say cruel, but he'll give you back the sting. You'll feel the sting of Lincoln
Wow.
but he's young. Yeah, definitely that. You should read, and I will have this in my book. There's an incident where one of the neighbors are getting married, and he wasn't invited to the
Oh
wedding.
no.
Oh yeah, he wasn't invited to the wedding, and boy, he did not take that lightly. And so he had some things to say about that, and actually wrote about it, and it was read all in the circles, and it was a very embarrassing thing, for the family with the couple. It was two people who had got married, and he had made some little crass joke about that. So that uh, changed my perception of Lincoln from this, humble, meek, quiet sort of guy to, oh my gosh, no, he gave you back what you gave him.
Dang.
So he hasn't quite molded into that, you know, Civil War, Gettysburg Address kind of personality just yet. Not in my book, he hasn't. So he's got some cleaning up to do by the time he gets there.
Wow. Now that is a
Yeah.
huge thing, listeners. Well, like
There
you
you
said,
go.
a lot of people that may also show like he, the change. Like I have to agree. For a long time, I believed Honest Abe was, that's who he was. He was a very honest person, which is funny.
Yeah.
And I'm going back to the documentary again on Lincoln that was on the History Channel. They did not mention what you said. They did not say that he was very callous, very witty with his words. I mean, they did say he was witty with his words, but when it came to a comeback or like a remark or
Oh
something,
yeah.
they did not mention that. They did not mention that at all. And it's often wonder, do you think that's also because we don't want to like say, tarnish quote unquote
Yeah.
image that we have of Lincoln? But do you think it's important to know, who he was before to see that growth?
Sure. Absolutely. I try to do this with anyone that I'm working on because part of the whole story of a good biography should be that you present the person with all of whatever you can find on them. Obviously, uh, you need to present the person for who he was or who she was, all the good, bad, and the ugly. Because if you're showing some, for example, with Lincoln, I'm showing you who he is at this stage of his life. How many teenagers can sit there and say, okay, we had it all figured out. We were polite, we were nice, we were humble, we were this, we were wise. We all have to go through these stages to get to a certain point in life. I mean, learning is something that never stops until you die, in my opinion. So it, it's important to show the reality of the person because number one, that is the truth in who they are, and you cannot for the sake of not tarnishing their image or something, you can't sit there and just gloss over and smooth over the ruffled up feathers. That's
Right.
not good biography, in my opinion. Good biography is when you're presenting all the information and you're letting your reader decide, okay, well, this person was X, Y, or Z, and they can take it from there, because your point or your job is to just present all of the evidence that you found through your research in the best, most unbiased way. Now, I get it. You're writing about someone you admire. There might be some of that that comes in your writing, no doubt about
Right.
it. But you're not deliberately sitting there and trying to make them into these superior beings. That is not good biography. That's not good history. That's not good writing, in my opinion. You have to present the facts, and then let the facts, let the reader decide based on that information as to who this person was.
Two minds think alike. That's exactly me
Yeah,
when it comes to writing history. And I have to agree. When we write about history, especially about someone that is important like Lincoln, it is important to know, who Lincoln was. And, the sides of him that, may not be the most, we would say, appropriate, we would use that term, to
sure.
his character. But as you said, it wouldn't do justice to Lincoln to not know who he was, how he grew up, what was he like before he changed, because not everyone stays the same person. People change over
Exactly.
time for good or for worse, and it's important
Exactly. And
to
I'm
note
sorry,
that.
go ahead. Yeah, and Gabriel, I agree with you. I'm sorry. Um, that's my point. That if you're showing the person with all of their, the features that were the struggles in their lives, and you're able to see them overcome that, you see the growth and the maturity in that person. That actually is the source of inspiration that I'm hoping to pass on to my readers. That, okay, look, we're also, maybe we have some problems, we have some flaws, we're not doing something right, but if this person could come out of that and become better, so can we. That's the whole point of my writing, of my work, anything I do. So trying to gloss that over, it just, I think, actually is an injustice to that person, because you're, in your hopes of presenting them in this wonderful way, you're taking away from what made them that way. Ultimately, those challenges are part of who that person was, and you have to put
Right.
it in there.
That is 100% true. That would almost be the equivalent of, let's say, we talked about the founding fathers, but don't note the fact that, that most of them were slaveholders at their time, and saying, well, that's a disservice to them because that is part of what, um, was ingrained in their life, in their sight. I mean, that's how they were raised. To not acknowledge that or not write about it is a disservice not just to them, but to the history of where they live. And it's also interesting if you go back to Lincoln's childhood, looking back the stepmother, because we have in these other literacy works of the stepmother being wicked and cruel. Lincoln got lucky, from what I've sources that I've been reading. He got lucky. He had a stepmother that actually loved him, cared for him, and helped him pursue his goal. As an author or someone that wants to twist the story, they can easily make the stepmom wicked and
Sure.
cruel, but that would not be accurate to who Lincoln was.
And actually, I think Lincoln would be very offended by that, to be honest
Hmm.
with you, because the truth is, she was an incredible. I mean, I won't even say stepmom. She was an incredible mother to him. She
Right.
encouraged him. She, in a way, was the one who continued to allow him or speak up for him when it came to his father, to allow him to have that time to read, and which he loved.
Right.
And so to sit there and make her into something she wasn't, even Lincoln wouldn't have stood for that. And Lincoln was actually twice blessed, in my opinion, because his own mom, Nancy Hanks, she was the one who actually taught him how to read and from the
Mm.
Bible. And she's the one who encouraged that in him until her death, obviously. And then once Sarah came into the picture, she continued encouraging him and building him up and allowing him that space and time to do the studies that he wanted to do. So he was blessed twice by two great moms.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
really, really cool. And it looks like we're nearing the end of this session, but was there anything else you want to talk about, Lincoln, or your book before we go into the closing segments?
Like I said, I'm working on the manuscript now, Gabriel, and I hope to have it done. This is the year where I'm going to be sending it off and to the publisher, and hopefully, I'm hoping that by next year it'll be out on the market. And this is a very important, I feel, vital time of Lincoln's life. And I'm hoping that my book will be unique in the sense of the way that I'm presenting it and presenting the information that it's already out there, no doubt about it. But there's always something new that you can add, whether it's through your word, whether it's through new research, whether it's through your own analysis that someone else may actually read and enjoy and get information from that they weren't getting elsewhere. So that's what I'm hoping for.
Nice. Very nice. Well, listeners, I hope you enjoyed episode 2 of the Historians Lounge. Before we end today's episode, I definitely wanted to say thank you to our guests for joining us. And Angelina, where can people find and engage with you to learn more about other projects you're working on and your book?
Sure. Thank you, Gabriel, so much again for having me. It was wonderful. I wish we had more time. And you were so accommodating. I really appreciate that. So people can go on my website, which is www.trehanstreasures.com. That's TREHANS treasures.com. And everything of my art, my journals, my handmade journals which I make, and my writings and my
Mhm.
book, everything is on there, so they can definitely find everything in there, and then they can find my social media sites from there too.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to link that in the description below this video so you can go and check them out, as well as make sure to check out her YouTube channel, if I'm not mistaken. Correct? You also have a
Oh
YouTube
yes,
channel.
definitely. And that's also, you can get to that through my website also. But yes, it's the same, Trehan's Treasures. Pretty much all my social media is Trehan's Treasures, so they can find me through any of that. And yeah, I do have a YouTube channel, which I think you're doing an excellent job. I'm so happy and proud of you for what you're doing. And I hope that your channel will continue to grow and you'll be able to get some great, fantastic guests. Because I wish I had that, someone doing what you're doing. And I remember when I first started my YouTube channel, I was looking for, anything related to history. And, I wasn't looking for those big channels, History
Right.
Channel and National Geographic. I was looking for something where we can see what you're doing. So
Hmm.
thank you for starting this up, and I wish you all the success. And yes, my channel is Trehan's Treasures, and people can follow me there. You'll see my art, you'll see my journals, you'll see some um, visits to different historical sites that I have. And I'm also starting to put out some videos about helping people, historians, writers, authors, artists like myself who might need some help with their business. So it's all there. And I hope that your viewers can come and find me and say hi.
Awesome. Well, listeners, thank you again for joining us. Make sure to like and subscribe this video and keep on lookout for future episodes, future interviews, and future updates from me and my projects. This is the Wandering Quill, the Wandering Scribe, signing off. Ta ta, everyone.